Classical liberalism puts the individual at the center. At its core, it's simple. People have rights, including the right to own things, make choices, and trade freely. The state exists to protect those rights, not to micromanage outcomes. That might sound abstract, but it's actually the scaffolding for a lot of everyday stuff we take for granted. Think about the last time you bought a coffee from a new cafe or sold a handmade item online. You didn't need a permit from some central planner to agree on a price or swap goods. That voluntary exchange, two people freely deciding what they value, is the engine classical liberals point to as the best way to create prosperity. When people are free to choose, experiment, and compete, better ideas rise, prices stay in check, and ordinary life gets more options. The idea comes from the Enlightenment. Thinkers like John Locke and Adam Smith argued that protecting individual liberty and private property encourages people to work, save, innovate, and trade. They believed the rule of law, predictable rules that apply equally to everyone, is crucial. Law shouldn't be used to pick winners and losers. It should make sure contracts are honored, theft is punished, and people can plan their lives without fear that rules will suddenly change to serve some politician's whim. That's why limited government is not about shrinking the state for ideology's sake. It's about drawing lines so power doesn't concentrate. When power piles up in the hands of a few, whether a monopolistic firm, an unaccountable bureaucratic agency, or a political boss, liberties suffer. Prices can be manipulated, opportunities closed off, and ordinary people lose the ability to shape their economic lives. Classical liberalism warns that concentrated power is the main threat to both prosperity and personal freedom. Relate this to your life. Owning a home feels secure because property rights exist and are enforceable. Starting a small business is possible because you can enter contracts and expect the law to protect you from fraud. Even having multiple brands to choose from in a shop is a product of competition, not a guaranteed outcome from a central planner. These are practical liberties that shape daily decisions: where you work, what you buy, how you save for the future. At the same time, classical liberalism isn't blind to problems. It recognizes that rules and institutions matter. A market needs honest weights and measures, transparent courts, and basic safety nets that allow people to take risks. The balance is to let people make their own choices while keeping powerful actors in check. So classical liberalism frames freedom and prosperity as partners. Give people rights, protect their property, let voluntary exchange flourish, and guard against concentrated power. And you get a society where ordinary people can build better lives through their own choices. Social liberalism keeps individual rights at its center, but it refuses to act as if rights exist in a vacuum. The idea is simple. A right on paper, like free speech, voting, or equal protection, doesn't really matter if people are starving, sick, or working 2 jobs without childcare. So social liberals argue that the state should be active, not to control lives, but to expand real opportunity so those freedoms can be exercised every day. Think about someone you know, maybe a neighbor, a friend, or even yourself, who missed a parent-teacher conference because taking time off meant losing pay. Or the person who avoided the doctor because a single visit could mean a month of rent unpaid. Those are the moments when formal liberties feel hollow. Social liberalism says, fix the material barriers. Invest in strong public schools, make early childhood education available so parents can work, ensure basic health care so a diagnosis doesn't ruin a life, and provide safety nets when things go wrong. These are practical moves that make civil liberties meaningful in ordinary life. Markets remain central in this view. Competition, entrepreneurship, and innovation are engines of prosperity. Social liberals don't seek to replace markets. They want markets that work for more people. That means smart policies, progressive taxation, targeted subsidies, workplace protections, anti-discrimination enforcement, so the fruits of a market economy are broadly shared. The goal isn't to eliminate inequality entirely, but to reduce crippling poverty and remove barriers that lock people out of opportunity. Practical examples help. A minimum wage and earned income tax credits lift working families out of extreme hardship. Universal or affordable healthcare prevents medical emergencies from becoming financial disasters. Public investment in transit and broadband opens up job markets. Anti-discrimination laws and affirmative outreach ensure that being a qualified candidate isn't undermined by race, gender, or background. These measures don't restrict freedom, they expand it by creating real choices. I've met people whose lives changed simply because a community clinic stayed open, or a scholarship made college possible, or reliable childcare allowed a parent to accept a full-time job. For them, freedom meant the chance to plan, to participate in politics, to raise a family without constant crisis. That's the human face of social liberalism. Liberty made tangible. At its best, this approach is both compassionate and pragmatic. It recognizes dignity as a baseline for a functioning democracy and treats public investment not as charity, but as infrastructure for freedom. By reducing poverty and discrimination, and by investing in people, social liberalism aims to make civil liberties more than words on paper. They become real options in daily life. Conservatism. Now let's look at conservatism, not as a caricature you see in headlines, but as a set of everyday instincts and priorities that many people recognize in their own lives. Think of the person who still keeps a family photo album, who volunteers at the local church or Rotary Club, who believes the high school mascot and the Saturday farmers market matter. That instinct to conserve comes from valuing continuity. Family rituals, local associations, and faith communities are seen as the glue that holds a neighborhood or town together. For many conservatives, these institutions aren't quaint relics. They're the primary schools of character, responsibility, and trust. Conservatism tends to favor gradual change over radical overhaul. Anyone who's rewritten a family recipe and found it lost something familiar understands why. The idea is that sudden shifts can tear social fabric. Reform should be cautious, tested, and respectful of what already works. That doesn't mean conservatives oppose change. They accept it when necessary, but they prefer solutions that build on experience, not break it. On economics and government, conservatives often prefer market-based solutions and limited state power. Picture a small business owner you know who wants fewer regulations so they can hire more people, or a neighbor who argues local charities will do a better job than a distant bureaucracy. The default belief is that individuals, families, churches, and local groups are best positioned to solve many problems because they understand their communities personally and can adapt faster. Still, conservatism isn't laissez-faire absolutism. There's a strong streak that supports state action to protect what people consider essential: national security, cultural heritage, or certain moral norms. That's why you'll hear conservative arguments in defense of historic downtown preservation, robust policing and border control, or laws aimed at maintaining public decency. To someone who values continuity, preserving symbols and institutions is part of protecting the story of a community. This creates a recognizable tension: trust markets and local initiative, but use government where it's needed to protect order, heritage, or the moral framework that makes community life possible. For example, conservatives might promote school choice and private charity while supporting public policies that teach civic history in schools or restrict activities seen as corrosive to community standards. To many people, this is coherent. It's about using the right tools in the right place. On a personal level, conservatism often comes from lived experience. Growing up in a neighborhood where neighbors looked out for one another, seeing elders pass on customs, or feeling that abrupt reforms eroded more than they fixed. Whether you recognize yourself in that story or not, it explains why some voters prize stability, respect for tradition, and incremental reform over sweeping change. That mix of caution, localism, and selective use of state power is what shapes conservative approaches to policy and daily life. Christian democracy. Moving on to Christian democracy. Think of it as a political approach that wears two hats at once, one that values tradition and social order, and another that insists we take care of each other. For a lot of people, this feels intuitive. You want stable communities and families, but you also don't want people left behind when life goes wrong. Christian democracy is rooted in Christian social teaching, but it's not only for the religious. The core idea is human dignity, that every person deserves respect and a chance to thrive, translated into policies. That's why Christian Democrats typically blend social conservatism, a belief in family, community, moral norms, with a genuine commitment to social welfare, strong social safety nets, support for families, and a market economy that's tempered by social responsibility. Imagine you're a small business owner. You believe in hard work and personal responsibility, but you also want a system where your employees don't fall through the cracks if they get sick or lose their job. Christian democracy's answer is the social market economy. Markets are allowed to drive growth and innovation, but the state steps in to regulate abuses and provide a safety net. It's not about crushing the market or letting it run wild. It's about balancing freedom with protection. Family policy is another big pillar. For someone juggling parenting and work, policies like paid parental leave, child allowances, and flexible school hours matter in a concrete way. Christian Democrats argue that strong families are the foundation of a healthy society, so public policy should support them financially, practically, and culturally, without forcing a single model of family life. One distinctive concept here is subsidiarity. That's the idea that decisions should be made as close to citizens as possible. Practically, that means local councils, schools, churches, and community groups get priority to solve problems before national governments step in. If your town hall can run an after-school program or a neighborhood charity can coordinate care for elderly neighbors, subsidiarity says let them, because local people usually know local needs best. It's a push for grassroots responsibility, not top-down bureaucracy. You can feel how this plays out in everyday life. A community center coordinating childcare so parents can work. A municipal program helping a family rent temporarily after a crisis. Or a school board designing programs that reflect local values. For many people, that mix of community, moral grounding, and social protection is reassuring. It promises order without cruelty and compassion without chaos. Next, we'll look at how a different tradition prioritizes individual liberty and markets in a way that contrasts with the Christian democratic approach. Social democracy. Think of social democracy as a way to take the best parts of markets, innovation, choice, competition, and wrap them in a safety net that lets real people live with dignity and hope. Picture Maria, who works long shifts at a manufacturing plant. She wants to provide for her kids, not live in constant fear of a missed paycheck or a surprise medical bill. Social democracy says, markets can create wealth, but a democratic society should make sure that wealth translates into secure lives for ordinary families. At its core, social democracy humanizes capitalism. It doesn't reject private businesses or entrepreneurship. It asks that they operate within rules designed to protect workers, consumers, and communities. That means strong labor rights, collective bargaining, fair wages, safe workplaces, so people like Maria have a real voice on the job. It means unions and worker protections aren't adversaries of growth. They're partners in building a stable consumer base and a healthier economy. Public services are the next piece. Think back to the childhood memory you probably have. A school that taught you to read, a nurse who patched your scraped knee, a library where you got lost in books. Social democracy makes those things universal. Universal healthcare, quality public education from preschool through university, reliable public transit, mental health services. These are investments in people. They level the playing field so the child born to a low-income family can still aspire to become a doctor, an engineer, or an entrepreneur. That's equality of opportunity, not just a slogan. How do we pay for it? Progressive taxation. It's a simple idea. People who earn more contribute a larger share to finance shared goods. That funds not only services, but also social insurance, unemployment benefits, pensions, disability support, so temporary setbacks don't become lifelong disasters. For someone who loses a job, that support is the difference between getting retrained and landing back on their feet or spiraling into poverty. Crucially, social democracy relies on democratic institutions. These are the mechanisms: elections, courts, independent regulators, transparent budgets, that decide how markets are shaped and how resources are distributed. It's not done by distant technocrats or opaque deals. It's done through politics and civic engagement. That means public debate, accountability, and the ability to change course when policies don't work. But what about ambition and risk-taking? Markets still reward innovation. A startup founder can pursue a new idea. Consumers can choose products. Investors can fund new technologies. Social democracy doesn't stifle that energy. It channels it. When people know they have healthcare, children's education, and a fair shot, they're more willing to take the risks that lead to real breakthroughs. In practice, social democracy looks like strong schools, a reliable family doctor, paid parental leave, decent unemployment benefits, and progressive taxes that fund those commitments. It's the kind of system where middle-class security isn't a lucky accident, but a democratic choice. And for billions of people, that human-centered blend of markets and public responsibility makes everyday life less precarious and more full of possibility. Democratic socialism. Think about the companies you've worked for, the neighborhoods you live in, the hospitals you count on when someone's sick. Democratic socialism isn't some distant ideology for academics. It's an idea that asks a simple question. What if the people who rely on those services also had a real say in how they're run? And what if basic needs were guaranteed, so people weren't scrambling just to survive? At its core, democratic socialism pursues a more egalitarian economy through democratic means. That means elections and civil liberties aren't optional add-ons. They're central. You still vote, you still speak up, you still organize. What changes is who holds economic power. Instead of decisions about workplaces, healthcare, or utilities being made primarily by private owners and shareholders, democratic socialism shifts more of that power into public or cooperative hands. Imagine a factory where the workers elect a board that helps decide production priorities, working conditions, and how profits are reinvested. Picture your local energy company owned by the municipality or a cooperative, where price hikes have to pass public scrutiny and investments prioritize long-term community needs, like clean infrastructure. These aren't abstract fantasies. Cooperative bakeries, credit unions, and municipally run utilities already exist in many places. Democratic socialism scales those models up in sectors that shape everyone's daily life. What makes it feel personal is the focus on social guarantees. Think of housing that doesn't force a single paycheck-to-paycheck month to determine whether your family has a roof, or healthcare that doesn't require you to choose between treatment and bankruptcy. Social guarantees mean basic security. Healthcare, education, a safety net are treated as rights, not privileges. That security changes the way people live. You're more likely to take a job that fits your skills instead of one you need just to survive. You can say no to unsafe work conditions because you're not terrified you'll lose access to essentials. Democratic socialism also values participation. It isn't top-down state control, it's about creating real avenues for workers and communities to influence decisions. Town halls, elected boards, co-op member votes, and stronger labor rights all create multiple democratic levers. Civil liberties, free press, assembly, and fair elections remain the guardrails that keep that participation meaningful and protect against concentration of power. Of course, critics worry about efficiency, bureaucracy, or the risk of stifling innovation. Those are valid concerns, and the answers lie in careful design, decentralizing decisions where possible, encouraging small-scale experimentation like worker cooperatives, and maintaining competitive spaces for innovation. The goal isn't uniformity, it's rebalancing power so economic life serves people, not the other way around. If you've ever felt powerless at work or anxious about losing health coverage or housing, democratic socialism speaks directly to that experience. It doesn't promise perfection overnight, but it reframes the conversation. What would our day-to-day lives look like if democratic values shaped both our politics and our economy? Marxism. Marxism frames history not as a parade of great men or abstract ideas, but as a story written by how people make a living. At its core is the claim that material conditions, who owns the tools, the factories, the land, shape the social world. That ownership creates classes, those who control production, capitalists, and those who sell their labor, workers. The tension between those interests is what drives social change. Think of it like two teams playing a long game where the rules are stacked. One side sets the schedule, the pay, and the scoreboard. That might sound theoretical, but you see it in everyday life. Maybe you've stayed late for a deadline while management praises flexibility, or you've watched housing costs eat a bigger slice of your paycheck. Marxists would point to those moments as symptoms of a system that concentrates wealth and power. Capitalism, they argue, tends to accumulate capital in fewer hands while extracting surplus value from workers. The difference between what workers are paid and the value they create. Those pressures generate recurring crises, layoffs, recessions, housing bubbles, and social unrest. For people living through them, it's not an abstract boom and bust cycle, but the reason your friend lost a job or why a small business closed. From there, Marxism predicts a bigger change. The contradictions within capitalism will make it unsustainable, opening the possibility of a transition to a classless society. That transition is imagined differently across the Marxist spectrum. Some see it as revolutionary, a rapid upheaval where workers seize the means of production. Others argue for a longer democratic path through unions, legislation, and public ownership until capitalist logic is replaced. You can map these differences onto things you might recognize: radical calls for rapid systemic change versus campaigns for higher minimum wages, universal healthcare, or stronger labor protections. A key debate is the role of the state after upheaval. Classical Marx famously wrote that the state would wither away once class antagonisms ended. But many Marxist movements saw the state as a necessary instrument to dismantle entrenched power and reorganize the economy. That gave rise to very different models, from social democratic welfare states that regulate capitalism and redistribute income, to revolutionary states that centrally plan production. Historical experiments, the welfare systems in Scandinavia, the revolutions of the 20th century, and later market reforms, all speak to the tensions Marxism wrestles with: how to balance democracy, efficiency, and equality. Personally, people often connect with Marxism not because they love grand theory, but because it names what they already feel: unfair work situations, invisible structural forces that shape lives, and the gap between what people produce and what they receive. Whether you agree with its predictions or not, Marxism offers a lens for asking practical questions. Who benefits from current arrangements? What kinds of reforms actually shift power? And if you imagine a fairer future, how would we build it? Piece by piece, or in a more radical break? Communism. So next up, communism. Picture the core idea: no state, no classes, and no private ownership of factories, farms, or mines. Everything that produces wealth would be owned in common and managed for everyone's benefit. It's not just a policy prescription, it's a vision of a different kind of society. one where the gap between factory owner and factory worker disappears, where your job isn't a ticket to survival, but a contribution to the common good. That vision can feel powerful when you first hear it. I remember as a kid reading about it in a history book and being struck by the promise, imagine not having to worry that someone else owns your livelihood. For people living in extreme inequality, that picture can be intensely appealing. The idea that your fate wouldn't hinge on private capital or inherited privilege. But the leap from that ideal to reality has often been messy. In the 20th century, movements inspired by communist theory seized state power and built heavily centralized systems. Rather than dissolving the state right away, many created one-party states that planned economies from the top down. Factories, farms, and services were nationalized and production targets were set by bureaucrats instead of markets. Supporters point to things that are hard to ignore. Many of these states achieved rapid industrialization. Whole regions moved from agrarian poverty into heavy industry in a generation. Public investment in education and health often expanded quickly, dramatically raising literacy and basic healthcare in places that had been neglected. For people who had never had access to a school or a doctor, those gains were transformative. I've talked to older relatives in rural areas who still speak gratefully about the new schools built in the 1950s and 60s. At the same time, critics highlight persistent and serious problems. Central planning often struggled to match supply with demand, which led to chronic shortages of basic goods and long lines for food and consumer items. Political power concentrated in a single party frequently translated into repression. Dissent was curtailed, independent media shut down, and political pluralism was limited or eliminated. Individual freedoms, from speech to freedom of association, were restricted in the name of stability or progress. So what should we make of this contrast? It's useful to separate the question of ideals from outcomes. The communist ideal pushed conversations about equality, social welfare, and the role of private ownership into the mainstream. Those debates reshaped labor rights, public education, and healthcare even outside communist states. Meanwhile, the historical experience shows the dangers of concentrating power without checks and balances. If you imagine building a more equal society today, the lesson isn't to copy any single model wholesale. It's to ask, how do we combine a commitment to shared prosperity with institutions that protect individual rights, allow critique, and prevent abuses of concentrated power? That tension between communal goals and personal freedoms is at the heart of any honest conversation about communism. What aspects of that balance matter most to you? Libertarianism. Libertarianism puts the individual front and center. At its core, it says, your life, your choices, your property, those should be protected above most collective goals. Imagine the state as a referee whose only job is to stop fouls, prevent theft, fraud, and violence. Beyond that, the referee mostly stays on the sidelines and lets people organize their own games. That idea can feel surprisingly practical when you think about everyday life. If you've ever paid a locksmith, signed a lease, or argued about a traffic accident, you've dealt with the kinds of rules libertarians care about: clear property rights and predictable enforcement. Libertarianism trusts that when people are free to make voluntary agreements, a lot of problems resolve themselves without a long list of regulations. A big part of this view is tolerance for risk and difference. Many libertarians support free migration because they see borders as artificial barriers to peaceful cooperation. If someone wants to move for work or to join family and they aren't committing harm, why block them? It's the same logic behind strong free speech protections. Ideas, even unpopular ones, should be exchanged freely so society can test and correct them, rather than rely on authorities to decide what's acceptable. That trust in voluntary order extends to activities most regulators would police. Whether it's selling a service, running a small gig economy business, or consenting adults choosing how to live, libertarians argue these markets should be legal unless they directly injure others. Think about local craft markets or side hustles you've used. Many of them operate because people voluntarily trade value for value. Libertarians believe more of life could run like that with less licensing and red tape. But it's not a fantasy of no rules. Libertarians emphasize protecting people from force and fraud. If someone's property is stolen or they're scammed, the government should step in and provide impartial protection. The difference is scale and scope. Instead of dozens of agencies micromanaging choices, the focus is on clear laws against aggression and systems that enforce contracts fairly. That perspective can feel personal. Maybe you've had an experience where a small business struggled under heavy regulation, or you've seen two neighbors resolve a dispute without calling authorities. Those moments illustrate the libertarian belief that people, given respect and responsibility, often solve problems better than distant bureaucracies. There are real debates within libertarianism too, between those who want a minimal state and others who imagine private alternatives for things like roads or courts. But the through line is consistent: maximize individual freedom, protect property and consent, and rely on voluntary cooperation whenever possible. Whether you agree or not, that emphasis on personal choice and responsibility is a powerful lens for rethinking how much control we want institutions to have over our daily lives. Minarchism. Minarchism narrows government down to three core things: courts to enforce contracts and settle disputes, policing to maintain public safety, and national defense to protect against outside threats. Everything else, schools, healthcare, roads, welfare, even some regulatory functions, moves into the hands of markets, communities, and voluntary associations. Think of it as keeping just the referee on the field and letting the players manage the game. To make this feel real, picture your neighborhood. If someone breaks into your home, you want an impartial police force to respond. If a contractor doesn't finish the job you paid for, you want a reliable court system to help enforce the agreement. If a hostile power threatens the country, you want an organized defense. Those are the services minarchists say only a minimal state can realistically and legitimately provide. Outside those areas, minarchists trust markets and civil society to fill most needs. So your local school might be a private institution funded by parents and local charities. Roads could be built and maintained by toll operators or homeowner associations. Disputes between companies might be settled through private arbitration and reputational mechanisms rather than endless regulation. The idea is that people working voluntarily, when motivated by reputation, profit, or communal ties, often deliver services more efficiently, innovatively, and responsively than a centralized bureaucracy. Advocates argue this setup maximizes individual freedom while preserving the essentials of security and rule of law. With fewer coercive powers concentrated in one place, people have more room to make choices about how to live, work, and cooperate. At the same time, courts and police provide the backbone that lets markets function. If you can't trust contracts to be enforceable or cannot rely on basic protection, trade and cooperation collapse. So, minarchists see the minimal state as an enabler of freedom, not its enemy. That said, minarchism doesn't pretend to be utopian. Its supporters point to incentives and decentralized solutions to handle common challenges: private insurance pools for risk sharing, non-profit organizations for social safety nets, competition among firms to curb abuses. Critics raise concerns about inequality, access to basic needs, and public goods, and those are part of the debate. But the core message remains simple: restrict coercive power to what's necessary to protect life, liberty, and property, and let voluntary institutions carry the rest. Up next, we'll examine a different libertarian strand that pushes this logic even farther and how it answers some of those criticisms. Anarchism. Think about the last time you were part of something that just worked without anyone bossing it around. Maybe it was a neighborhood bake sale where everyone showed up and divided tasks naturally, or a group project where people found their roles and the results surprised you. That ease, that trust in one another, It's the everyday feeling anarchism tries to scale up. Anarchism, in simplest terms, calls for a society without a state, not chaos, but organized life built on voluntary cooperation and self-managed communities. Imagine cities run by neighborhood assemblies, workplaces owned and run by the people who actually do the work, and services coordinated by networks of mutual aid rather than top-down orders. The core idea is this. When you remove centralized coercive power, people can and will organize themselves responsibly if given the tools and trust. There are different strands within anarchism that emphasize different tools to get there. Some stress mutual aid, the notion that people help one another because they share common interests and vulnerabilities. That's not a romantic ideal. Look at community responses after floods or during a power outage when folks pool resources and skills without waiting for permission. Anarcho-communists and mutualists often highlight this, arguing for shared ownership of resources and cooperative distribution. Other strands focus on direct democracy and workplace self-management. Anarcho-syndicalists, for instance, see labor unions and worker councils as the basis for broader social transformation. Picture a factory where decisions aren't made in a distant executive suite, but at the assembly floor, where those affected have a real voice. Decisions are made horizontally through debate, delegation, and recallable mandates, not through a chain of command. Then there are forms that imagine markets without a state. These thinkers argue for voluntary exchange and decentralized markets, but without the privileges granted by state power. They envision competition between worker cooperatives or small businesses that operate on fair terms because there's no state to enforce monopolies or subsidies. This strand is controversial among other anarchists, many of whom reject capitalism entirely, but it reflects the broader anarchist suspicion of centralized authority, including state-backed economic power. What ties all these strands together is a deep belief in people's ability to self-organize. Anarchists argue that institutions should be as local, voluntary, and accountable as possible. Instead of assuming people need rulers, anarchism assumes people can negotiate, cooperate, and solve problems when treated as equals. That doesn't mean ignoring conflict or hard choices. It means setting up processes that allow communities to resolve those issues without resorting to coercive hierarchies. If this sounds idealistic, remember the small, imperfect experiments around us. Co-ops, community gardens, time banks, emergency mutual aid networks. They're messy, they argue, they change. But they also show a simple truth. Given trust and structures that empower, people will often do the work of building the society they want. Next, we'll look at how these ideas have been tried in history and what lessons they offer for today. Anarcho-Syndicalism. Anarcho-Syndicalism takes something most of us already know, our jobs, our co-workers, the daily grind, and says, what if that's the place where we build a different world? Instead of seeing unions only as bargaining machines that pop up when contracts expire, anarcho-syndicalists imagine unions as living, ongoing organs of power, the vehicle for fighting day-to-day injustices and for inventing how we'll run things once we stop letting bosses call all the shots. Think about your own workplace for a second. Imagine a shop floor where people meet regularly in assemblies, not just to grumble, but to decide how work is organized, who does what, and how any surplus gets used. Those assemblies send out delegates to coordinate with other workplaces, but those delegates can be recalled, they rotate, and they carry mandates from the assembly. They're not managers, they're messengers of collective decisions. That federation of workplaces handles logistics, assigns production tasks according to need and capacity, and makes sure surplus is shared. Some reinvested in the workplace, some pooled for community projects, and some given out as solidarity support when other workers strike or face hardship. Direct action is the heartbeat of this model. A strike isn't just a tactic to extract concessions, it's a practical classroom. When you organize a walkout, you learn how to plan, how to maintain solidarity, how to run picket lines, how to sustain communication between different sites. You learn to make decisions collectively under pressure. Those skills, negotiating, consensus building, coordinating, are exactly the skills you need to run a workplace democratically. In that sense, every successful sick-out, sit-in, or coordinated slowdown trains people in self-government. There are real-world echoes of this in workers' cooperatives and in historical moments like the Spanish Revolution of 1936, where entire industries were run by worker federations. Today, smaller-scale examples show the same logic. When workers seize control of a closed factory and run it, they don't just keep producing. They democratize work, share the risks and the rewards, and knit stronger ties across neighborhoods. Of course, it's messy. Coordinating production across many workplaces requires planning, trust, and some shared values. There are tactical questions about markets, technology, and how to respond to sabotage or legal pressure. That's why education and ongoing organizing matter. The ideas only work when people practice them and adapt them together. If you ever felt that your workplace could be run better by the people who actually do the work, Anarcho-Syndicalism gives that feeling a strategy. Use unions not as temporary bargaining clubs, but as democratic schools and networks that can both defend daily needs and build lasting alternatives. Anarcho-Capitalism. Now let's dig into Anarcho-Capitalism, the version of radical markets that goes all the way, no state, period. Picture a world where every public service you currently get from government is offered by private firms or voluntary associations under competing contracts. Need a police service? You sign up with Neighborhood Shield. Need a court? Your condo association hires Arbiter.co. Want road maintenance? Pay roadways. The idea is that markets, not votes, decide how law, courts, and security are structured. Supporters paint this as a story of choice and accountability. Imagine you're a small business owner constantly frustrated by slow, one-size-fits-all courts. Under anarcho-capitalism, you could pick a dispute resolution provider known for fast, predictable rulings tailored to commercial disputes. And if it starts making bad calls, you switch. Security firms would have to keep clients safe or lose business. Reputation, contracts, and competition are the main mechanisms to keep providers honest. Proponents argue private firms have stronger incentives to be efficient, innovative, and responsive than bureaucracies insulated from customer feedback. That can feel empowering on a personal level. Think about choosing your health insurance today. You shop plans based on what matters to you. Anarcho-capitalists imagine doing that for law and safety as well. You'd be able to prioritize privacy, strictness, or low cost, and you'd pay directly for what you want rather than being part of a monopoly provider funded by taxes. But there are sharp and human concerns on the other side. Critics warn that when law and security are commodities, money buys influence. If you're a renter working 3 jobs, you might not be able to afford the premium security firm that protects a millionaire's gated community. Justice could become tiered. The wealthy get faster, friendlier arbiters. The poor get low-cost providers with fewer resources. Imagine an arbitration clause in every contract that steers disputes to private tribunals favored by large corporations. That's already happening in limited ways, and critics fear it would become ubiquitous. There's also the risk of private firms accumulating coercive power. A security company with a large client base could effectively control territories, setting rules that bind non-clients too. Enforcement beyond contract, like collecting fines or evicting people, raises questions about accountability and checks on abuse. Public goods and long-term investments, such as national defense or environmental regulation, may be underprovided because firms have little incentive to pay for benefits enjoyed by all. So anarcho-capitalism is a vivid thought experiment about what radical marketization could look like in everyday life. More choice and market discipline for some, but serious worries about inequality, concentrated power, and access to fair justice for others. Progressivism. Now let's talk about progressivism, not as a rigid label, but as a practical approach that shows up when people decide to use public policy to make life fairer and cleaner for everyone. Think about the last time you wanted clearer nutrition labels, cleaner air in your city, or more transparency from a company that holds your data. Those are progressive impulses, using laws and regulations to expand rights, to check corruption, and to limit the outsized power of actors who affect our daily lives. At its heart, progressivism trusts two things: that institutions can change, and that change should be guided by evidence and inclusion. That means policymakers lean on scientific expertise, from epidemiologists during a pandemic to urban planners working on public transit, instead of letting decisions be driven only by political convenience or private profit. It also means widening who gets a seat at the table. When policies are written only by insiders, they tend to protect insiders. Progressives push for mechanisms that bring in diverse voices, community consultations, participatory budgeting, and stronger voting access, so people who've been left out finally have influence. You can see how this plays out in everyday life. Minimum wage hikes, workplace safety rules, anti-discrimination laws, regulations on toxic chemicals. These are all attempts to adapt old institutions to new social realities. They're not about nostalgia or rigid ideology. They're about updating the rulebook so it works for people now. And when corruption shows up, whether it's shady lobbying, backroom deals, or closed bidding on public contracts, progressivism pushes for transparency, campaign finance limits, open government data, stronger ethics rules, and independent oversight bodies. Regulating powerful actors is a big part of the story. That can look like antitrust enforcement against monopolies, stricter financial rules to prevent speculative bubbles, or new privacy laws to rein in tech platforms that harvest personal data. These actions aren't anti-business for the sake of it. They're about creating markets and public spaces where competition and accountability protect ordinary people, not just shareholders. What makes progressivism feel personal is how these policy shifts touch everyday choices. Being able to trust the water from your tap, knowing your doctor's recommendations aren't influenced by corporate kickbacks, or being able to vote without unnecessary barriers. It's about practical remedies that reduce harm and expand opportunity. The ultimate goal is pragmatic. Adapt our institutions so they reflect current realities, climate risks, digital economies, changing demographics, while widening participation so more people shape those adaptations. It's less about grand theory and more about steady, evidence-based reform that makes life more just and more livable for everyone. Centrism. Now, centrism, think of it as the what works lane. Instead of starting with an ideological rulebook, centrists start with a problem and ask which ideas, from wherever they come, best solve it. That might mean borrowing a tax break from the right because it encourages small business growth, and pairing it with a targeted safety net from the left so workers don't fall through the cracks. I remember living in a town where the school board fights were vicious. Some parents wanted more testing and stricter discipline, others wanted more arts and counselling. A centrist on that board didn't promise to fully satisfy either camp. Instead, they pushed for smaller, measurable reforms. Revise the testing schedule, pilot restorative justice in 2 schools, and expand after-school arts through a local grant. Nothing radical, but something that made both sides feel heard and the kids better off. That's centrism in action. Incremental, practical, coalition building. Centrists prize compromise because governing a diverse society usually means you need broad buy-in. Big, sweeping plans can be captivating, but they can also stall in polarized legislatures. Incremental change, policy bites small enough for multiple groups to swallow, can actually move the needle faster. It's like steering a large ship. Sudden turns capsize, but steady adjustments keep you on course. Pragmatism also shows up in how centrists evaluate evidence. If a market-based approach reduces costs without harming people, great. If a social program demonstrably improves outcomes, it deserves investment. The goal is outcomes, not doctrinal purity. Yes, critics accuse centrism of being wishy-washy or lacking moral passion. A centrist would answer that steady, sustainable improvement matters when people's lives are at stake. So when you think about an issue you care about, climate, healthcare, schools, imagine combining the best tested tools from across the spectrum, prioritizing policies that build wide support and deliver tangible results. That's how centrism tries to turn political friction into workable solutions people can live with. Neoliberalism shifted the conversation about how economies should work. Starting in the late 20th century, governments pushed market liberalization, privatization, and freer global trade. To make it human, think of the local utility that used to be a public service, or the bus routes you relied on. Suddenly there's a private company promising efficiency and lower prices. For some people that meant cheaper, faster service. For others it meant fewer routes, higher fares, or jobs cut. The core belief is simple and persuasive. Competition and open markets are the engines of growth and innovation. When firms compete, they try to make better products at lower costs, which can give you more choice at the store and lower bills. Supporters point to examples like cheaper electronics, expanded internet access, and global supply chains that bring a wider range of goods to everyday life. But ideas that make sense on a spreadsheet don't always translate cleanly to people's daily routines. Critics argue neoliberal policies widened inequality and weakened labor power. If a company can outsource work to wherever wages are lowest, local workers can lose good jobs. If public services are sold to private firms, profit motives can conflict with public needs. Those dynamics can leave communities feeling hollowed out. Fewer stable jobs, less bargaining power for unions, and increased economic insecurity. Think about grocery shopping. Prices might fall for some items because of global sourcing and competition, but the people stocking shelves or trucking goods might face precarious schedules and low pay. Your options grow, but so do the hidden costs. Longer commutes, reduced benefits, or a town that loses its tax base when a factory shutters. Importantly, neoliberalism also reshaped governments. Tax cuts, deregulation, and a push to shrink the public sector became common. That can spur entrepreneurship and investment, but it also reduces the capacity of states to address inequality, provide healthcare, or support retraining for workers displaced by change. The COVID pandemic showed how uneven those safety nets can be. In the end, neoliberalism is a mixed legacy. For many of us, it delivered innovations, variety, and lower headline prices. For others, it meant insecurity, declining job quality, and communities left behind. When we talk about policy today, the debate isn't just abstract. It matters for your job, your town, and the choices available to your family. Understanding both the gains and the costs helps us argue for reforms that preserve competition and innovation while protecting workers and communities. So when the next policy debate shows up, about trade deals, privatizing a service, or cutting regulations, ask who benefits, who pays the hidden costs, and what safeguards will protect ordinary people. Think about the next time a bus line is sold, a hospital contract is put out to tender, or a factory announces layoffs. Those are the moments when policy hits your daily life and the answers matter. Period. Ordoliberalism and the social market. At its core, ordoliberalism says something simple that still surprises people. Markets don't run themselves fairly just because they exist. They need rules, clear, enforceable rules, so that everyone plays by the same standards. Think about your local bakery competing with a supermarket chain. If the chain could use its power to pressure suppliers into exclusive deals, raise wholesale prices for everyone else, or undercut competitors with loss-leading tactics that only it can sustain, that healthy bakery would vanish. Ordoliberalism wants to stop that from happening before it becomes normal. So, what does that look like in practice? First, a strong legal framework. Not empty promises, but laws and institutions that actually work. Independent competition authorities, transparent procurement rules, straightforward corporate governance standards. These institutions aren't there to micromanage every business decision. They set the boundaries. Once the boundaries are clear and enforced, people can plan, invest, start businesses, and trust that success will come more from good ideas than from bullying power play. Second, preventing monopolies and ensuring competition. This isn't ideology for its own sake. It's practical. A competitive market keeps prices reasonable and innovation moving. Take tech platforms. When one company controls most of the distribution, it can decide what gets seen or what's charged to sellers. That power can be abused. Ordoliberalism supports measures like breaking up truly dominant positions, blocking anti-competitive mergers, or forcing interoperability so smaller players can compete. The goal is to keep the field open, not to punish success. Third, social insurance as a complement, not a contradiction. Markets can be dynamic and messy. People lose jobs, industries shift, new skills become necessary. Ordoliberalism accepts that and says the state should provide a safety net, unemployment insurance, retraining programs, accessible healthcare. I like to think of it this way. Competition drives progress, but solidarity cushions the fall. If you or I start a business and it fails, we shouldn't be left destitute. We should have the chance to try again. That makes risk-taking socially sustainable. What ties these pieces together is the idea of stable rules. Businesses and citizens alike need predictability. If laws change overnight or enforcement is arbitrary, trust evaporates. Stable, impartial institutions make long-term planning possible. Whether it's a farmer deciding to invest in new equipment or a young professional choosing a career path. This model isn't about a nanny state or about pure laissez-faire. It's about creating a competitive economy anchored by fairness and solidarity. That balance is why ordoliberalism still feels relevant. It recognizes human ambition and vulnerability at the same time. When rules are fair, markets become engines of opportunity for more people, not just a few at the top. And that is an idea most of us can agree on. Whether we're running a small shop, working a salaried job, or scrolling through apps. Green politics. Think about the last time you stood somewhere quiet, a park at dusk, a fishing pier, or even your own backyard, and felt how fragile it all seemed. Green politics starts from that feeling, but turns it into policy, recognizing that nature has limits and that our choices today shape the lives of people who haven't been born yet. It's not just about planting trees or banning plastic straws. It's a politics that centers ecological limits, insists on intergenerational justice, and pushes a big shift in how we produce and use energy. Practically, that means prioritizing clean, renewable energy and redesigning production so goods last longer and waste becomes rare. Think community solar panels that your neighbor can buy into, or local repair cafes where people learn to fix their phones instead of replacing them. Those small, human examples add up. They reduce emissions, keep money circulating locally, and create jobs that can't be outsourced. At the same time, green politics links environmental repair with social equity. If a new wind farm or transit line is built, who benefits? If a factory closes because it's toxic, who gets retraining and who gets left behind? A just transition makes sure workers and frontline communities, often low-income neighborhoods or indigenous groups who've borne the worst impacts of pollution, are first in line for new opportunities, compensation, and a voice in planning. I've seen this personally in a small town where a coal plant shut down. When workers were included in the planning, retraining programs, and a community-owned solar project grew out of the change, the anger turned into momentum. Another core idea is local democracy. Big problems are global, but many solutions work best close to home. Citizens' assemblies, neighborhood councils, and local budgeting processes let people decide how to spend public funds on things that matter. bike lanes, retrofitting schools for energy efficiency, food co-ops. These kinds of decisions build trust and resilience in ways that top-down policies often don't. Risk is treated differently under green politics too. The precautionary principle, better safe than sorry, argues we shouldn't gamble the future on technologies or chemicals whose harms we don't fully understand. That's why regulation matters, not as a brake on innovation, but as a way to steer it towards safer, fairer outcomes. Finally, green politics asks us to rethink what prosperity means. GDP measures how much stuff we produce, but not whether people are healthy, happy, or living within the planet's limits. New metrics, well-being indices, ecological footprint accounting, measures of community resilience give a fuller picture. That's the kind of success I want for my kids: clean air, meaningful work, time for friends and family, and a planet that's still thriving. If that resonates, there are concrete steps you can take. Support local renewable projects, vote for candidates who back just transition policies, push for citizen-led climate planning in your town, and start conversations with neighbors about shared solutions. Green politics isn't an abstract ideology. It's a practical, community-minded approach that asks us to care about the limits of nature and the rights of future generations, and to act accordingly. Eco-socialism takes the climate conversation out of think tanks and spreadsheet models and drops it into our daily lives. Think about your commute, sitting in traffic, watching buses go by, half empty, because fares are high and service is patchy. Think about your energy bill in winter, or the fenced-off lot in your neighborhood that used to be green. Those are not just personal annoyances. They're symptoms of a system that prioritizes profit over the common good. At its core, eco-socialism marries two ideas: that essential services and key resources, energy, transit, land, should be operated in the public interest, and that our economic planning must be shaped by ecological limits. The argument is simple but powerful. When private companies chase profit, they tend to overuse resources, cut corners, and underprice the environmental damage they cause. Costs like air pollution, flooded neighborhoods, or exhausted aquifers don't show up on a quarterly report. They get passed on to communities, to future generations, or simply written off as externalities. So eco-socialism pushes for democratic control, not a distant bureaucracy, but accountable, community-driven ownership. Imagine your local utility being a municipal cooperative where decisions about new generation, energy efficiency programs, and pricing are made in public meetings rather than in boardrooms. Picture transit that's planned with riders' lives in mind. Affordable fares, frequent service, routes that connect jobs, schools, and parks. Envision land managed through community land trusts so that vacant lots become gardens, affordable housing, or flood buffers, rather than being hoarded by speculative investors. These aren't abstract ideas. There are cities and regions that give a sense of what this looks like in practice. Community-owned wind and solar projects in parts of Europe and the US that return profits to residents. Municipal utilities that reinvest in local grid upgrades and weatherization programs. Transit systems built around the needs of people rather than parking revenue. On a human level, that translates into warmer homes, shorter commutes, cleaner air, and neighborhoods that don't get bulldozed for short-term gain. Critics ask, won't public ownership be inefficient? The eco-socialist answer is that democratic control changes the incentives. When the goal isn't maximizing profit, but meeting people's needs while staying within ecological limits, investment flows into long-term resilience, insulating hundreds of thousands of homes, electrifying buses, restoring wetlands. That also creates good jobs, retrofitting buildings, building and maintaining renewable infrastructure, jobs that can't be outsourced and which strengthen local economies. Personally, I've seen how small shifts can make a tangible difference. A friend in a city with a municipal utility told me how a community solar project cut his electricity bill and sent dividends back to the neighborhood association. A parent I know relies on reliable, affordable buses to get to work. Losing that service would mean losing a paycheck. Eco-socialism ties those everyday wins to the bigger fight against climate breakdown. The point isn't scarcity or punitive measures, it's redesign. Democratic public control helps align resources with human needs and planetary boundaries. It's about building systems that are fairer, cleaner, and more resilient. Next, we'll look at another approach people point to for climate action and where it overlaps and clashes with what eco-socialism proposes. Next, nationalism, the idea that political authority should reflect a shared national identity. Think of it like this: when a group of people feels they belong together in a deeper way than just living in the same place, they often want their government to express that bond. That desire can take very different shapes. On one side is civic nationalism. This version says, membership in the nation is a matter of law, shared values, and active citizenship. It's the kind of patriotism that asks, do you take part? Do you follow the rules? Do you believe in the same basic principles? If you've ever moved to a new city or country and felt welcomed after learning the language, voting, or joining community events, you've seen civic nationalism in action. It can feel inclusive, a promise that anyone willing to commit to the public rules and ideals can be part of the national story. On the other side is ethnic nationalism, which ties belonging to ancestry, culture, language, or religion. Here, continuity of lineage and tradition matter. It's the version that can make people say, this country is ours because our grandparents were here and we share the same background. That can create a powerful sense of rootedness and identity. Imagine family festivals, local dialects, recipes passed down through generations. But it can also feel excluding to those who don't fit the inherited mold. Why does the distinction matter? Because the shape nationalism takes influences policy and everyday life. Civic nationalism tends to push toward institutions that protect individual rights, equal citizenship, and openness to newcomers who adopt the shared civic code. Ethnic nationalism tends to prioritize cultural preservation, sometimes leading to policies that restrict immigration or favor a dominant group's language and customs in public life. Both forms can inspire something positive, the drive for self-rule. When people believe they form a distinct nation, they often demand the ability to govern themselves rather than be ruled by outsiders. That impulse fueled independence movements and the formation of democratic states across history. For many, nationalism has been the motivating force behind movements that gave people a chance to shape laws and institutions that reflect their collective will. But the same force can also turn inward and exclude. When national identity becomes a test of belonging, it can be used to marginalize minorities, dismiss dissent, or justify discrimination. If the question becomes who belongs rather than what principles do we share, the result can be policies that close the door on newcomers, silence different voices, or create citizenship hierarchies. So how do we make this feel personal and relevant? Look at your own neighborhood. Do people come together around shared civic rituals like town meetings, school events, or voting campaigns? That's civic nationalism at work. Or consider family stories and cultural traditions that bind people through shared heritage. That's the pull of ethnic nationalism. Both are part of our lives, and both can shape how welcoming or divided a community feels. Understanding nationalism means recognizing its dual nature. It can fuel self-determination and democratic participation, but it can also breed exclusion if identity becomes a gatekeeping tool. The challenge and the choice is what kind of national story we want to live by. Civic nationalism. Moving from ideas about ancestry and bloodlines, civic nationalism flips the script. It defines the nation by what we do together, not where we come from. Think less about family trees and more about shared institutions, rights, and everyday participation. It's an invitation. Citizenship as a practice, not a pedigree. Picture it this way. You and a neighbor might be from different countries, speak different languages at home, eat different foods, but both of you vote in the same elections, follow the same constitution, and expect the same basic protections. That shared expectation, that everyone is entitled to equal rights and must respect the rules of the game, is the heart of civic nationalism. I remember when a friend from another country became a citizen. The ceremony felt less about ancestry and more about commitment, a promise to uphold laws, to take part, to belong by choice. That feeling is powerful because it makes belonging something you earn and practice, not something you inherit. Civic nationalism stresses equal citizenship. That means laws, rights, and public services apply to everyone the same way. It also means that identity is layered with a common civic culture. Respect for free speech, tolerance for dissent, faith in impartial institutions, and a willingness to argue and compromise in public. Those shared habits create cohesion without demanding cultural uniformity. You can keep your traditions and still be part of the same political community. Loyalty to constitutional norms is another key piece. In practical terms, this looks like trusting courts to settle disputes, accepting election results when rules were followed, and defending minority rights even when a majority disagrees. This is where civic nationalism can act as a guardrail against tribalism. Instead of loyalty to a leader or a lineage, loyalty is to principles, rule of law, separation of powers, equal protection. When those principles are held in common, they hold diverse groups together. But it's not idealistic fluff. It has real challenges. How do you cultivate a shared civic culture without erasing different histories and languages? How do newcomers learn civic norms, and how does the majority remain open to change? The answer often lies in institutions that encourage participation. Public schools that teach civic reasoning, community centers that host dialogues, and simple practices like voting or jury duty that involve people in collective decision-making. Civic nationalism aims to blend unity and pluralism. Unity through shared political commitments, pluralism through respect for cultural difference. It asks each of us to contribute by obeying laws, by voting, by showing up for neighbors, and in return promises membership based on consent, not dissent. So ask yourself, what practices in your community make you feel included? Where could more civic bridges be built? Next, we'll look at how cultural nationalism compares and contrasts with this civic approach. Populism. Think of politics as a story with two characters, the ordinary people and the elite who are out of touch or actively corrupt. That's the heartbeat of populism. It's not really an ideology in the traditional sense. It's a way of framing everything. When someone says they're stealing from you, or the system is rigged against us, that's populist language. It draws a clear moral line, we, the virtuous people, versus them, the corrupt elite. You've probably seen this play out in different places. On the left, populists point at wealthy corporations, CEOs, and a political class that protects profits while wages stagnate. Their answer is usually redistribution, higher taxes on the rich, stronger unions, bigger safety nets. On the right, populists often target cultural institutions, immigration, or cosmopolitan elites who are accused of ignoring national identity and security. Their solutions might be stricter borders, law and order policies, or policies that protect traditional values. The common thread is the same: blame an elite, promise to restore power to the people. What makes populism distinctive is style and strategy. It loves mass mobilization. Instead of relying on party machinery, it rallies people directly. Huge rallies, viral videos, social media messages, referendums, or movements on the streets. Leaders speak plainly, sometimes bluntly, and appeal to emotions and identity more than to policy details. That directness can be refreshing. If you've ever felt ignored by formal politics, hearing a leader speak like a neighbor can be electrifying. That personal connection is why populism resonates. Imagine being in a town where factories close down and no one seems to listen. Suddenly, a leader shows up and says, "I see you. You matter." That matters. It gets people involved and can push long stagnant issues into the spotlight. But that same style can also shortcut complexities and institutional checks. When leaders prioritize direct appeal over party mediation, decisions can be made based on emotion or loyalty rather than debate and expertise. Parties, for all their flaws, often provide negotiation, compromise, and policy detail. Populism's strength, its ability to simplify and mobilize, can also be its weakness if it fosters polarization or scapegoating. At its core, populism is a powerful political tool. It reframes politics as a moral struggle, energizes ordinary people, and demands that elites be held accountable. Whether it becomes a force for positive change or a source of division depends on the specific grievances it taps into, the solutions it proposes, and how it balances passion with responsibility. Republicanism. Now let's dig into republicanism. Not the party, but the political idea that shapes how we think about freedom and civic life. At its heart are three linked commitments: civic virtue, a mixed government to prevent concentration of power, and a conception of freedom as non-domination. Put simply, republicanism says freedom isn't just doing what you want, it's not living at the mercy of someone else's arbitrary will. Think of a time you felt powerless. Maybe you had a boss who could change your shift or cut your hours on a whim, or a landlord who could raise the rent overnight. That feeling, the anxiety that someone else can decide your fate without reason, is what Republican thinkers want to eliminate from political life. Freedom as non-domination means no one can put you in that position of vulnerability. Laws, institutions, and civic habits are supposed to stop arbitrary power before it starts. That's where civic virtue comes in. Republics rely on citizens who care about the common good, not just their private interests. Civic virtue isn't about being saintly, it's practical. It's the neighbor who shows up for the community meeting, the person who serves on a jury, the parent who volunteers at the school board, the voter who researches candidates. These are ordinary acts, but together they create a social fabric that resists domination. When people participate, leaders are watched, accountable, and less likely to wield power arbitrarily. Mixed government is the structural side of the story. Classical Republicans worried that any single form of rule, unchecked rule by one person, a small elite, or a fickle majority, corrodes liberty. The solution was balance. Combine elements of monarchy, stable executive leadership, aristocracy, stable councils of experienced people, and democracy, broad participation. Modern versions show up as separation of powers, checks and balances, and layered governance, local, regional, national. Those layers are there, so power must be negotiated, debated, and constrained. No single actor should be able to decide everything. Institutions matter because they convert civic energy into durable safeguards. Independent courts, transparent bureaucracies, free press, election rules that prevent hijacking. These are design features that keep the powerful from turning arbitrary. But institutions alone don't do the job. They need citizens to use them, to vote, to read budgets, to call out corruption, to support whistleblowers. If you shrug and let government be only a spectacle, domination creeps back in. So what can you do? Small civic gestures add up. Vote thoughtfully, show up at local meetings, serve when asked, demand clear explanations for decisions that affect your life. Teach children that politics is about living together fairly, not about scoring points. When you act, you're practicing the civic virtue republicanism values, and you're helping to make sure freedom means real security from arbitrary power, not just the freedom to be bossed around. Liberal conservatism. Now let's turn to liberal conservatism. A blend that might sound contradictory at first, but it hits a lot of familiar notes once you break it down. Think of someone who loves the idea of people building businesses and keeping the rewards of their work, but also values family dinners, local churches, neighborhood schools, and institutions that have stood the test of time. At its core, liberal conservatism pairs market liberalism, a belief in enterprise, private property, and competitive markets, with a conservative social outlook. Imagine my friend Maria, who runs a small bakery. She wants low taxes and fewer needless regulations so she can experiment with new pastries and hire another employee. She also volunteers at her kids' school and worries about preserving the town's annual fair. She doesn't want radical upheavals. She wants a stable community where business can flourish and traditions continue. That combination shows up in practical policy preferences. Supporters favor property rights and the rule of law because those create the predictability needed for investment and planning. Fiscal restraint matters too. Think of it like running a household. Most of us try to avoid piling up unsustainable debt. We prioritize, cut waste, and save for rainy days. Liberal conservatives apply the same logic to government budgets, arguing that long-term prosperity depends on responsible spending, not continuous borrowing. At the same time, they're not blind to social responsibility. Rather than tearing down institutions they see as valuable, they prefer gradual reform. Picture renovating an old family home instead of demolishing it. Keep what works, update what's broken. That might mean targeted welfare programs that encourage work, education policy that strengthens local schools, or criminal justice reforms implemented carefully to maintain social order while correcting injustices. What makes this strand relatable for many people is balance. It's the person who believes in hard work and private initiative, but also in belonging to something bigger than themselves. A neighborhood, a faith community, a civic tradition. It prizes entrepreneurship, yet recognizes that markets alone don't solve every problem. They need rules, norms, and trusted institutions to function fairly. On the cultural side, liberal conservatism tends to defend traditions and social norms that foster stability, not out of nostalgia alone, but because stable norms reduce uncertainty and help communities coordinate. That's why its proponents often push for incremental policy changes, measuring the effects as they go, rather than betting everything on sweeping reforms. Understanding liberal conservatism this way, as a pragmatic, cautious partnership between markets and tradition, helps explain why it appeals to small business owners, community leaders, and many families trying to balance economic ambition with social stability. Social conservatism. Building on those broader principles, social conservatism homes in on how we live together day to day. The moral habits, family structures, and cultural practices that shape neighborhoods, schools, and houses of worship. For people who lean this way, politics isn't just about taxes or borders, it's about passing down a way of life that feels rooted and steady. Maybe you remember a grandparent who insisted on Sunday dinners, or a teacher who taught not just math, but punctuality and respect. Social conservatives want laws and institutions that reinforce those kinds of norms. That often means supporting measures that use law and education to preserve cultural heritage and moral standards. You'll hear them argue for curricula that include history from a perspective that celebrates national or religious contributions, or for policies that encourage marriage and stable family environments because they see strong families as the building block of healthy communities. For someone who grew up in a small town where the church was the center of social life, these priorities probably make intuitive sense, protecting the rituals and rhythms that held the community together. On controversial topics, social conservatives tend to back restrictions they see as protecting public morality or vulnerable people. That can include tighter rules on drug use, limits on access to pornography, or more restrictive abortion laws. The motivation they often give is not punishment for its own sake, but safeguarding children, preventing social harm, and honoring what they view as the sanctity of life. If you've ever worried about the messages your teenager receives online or seen addiction tear apart a family, you can understand why someone would want a stronger public response. Family policy is central. Social conservatives usually favor tax incentives for married couples, support for stay-at-home parents, school choice that allows religious education, and childcare policies that emphasize parental involvement. Think of the parent who chooses a faith-based school because it aligns with the values taught at home. Social conservatives argue the state should make space for and sometimes support that choice. Religious freedom in the public square is another key plank. People who hold this view worry that faith-based voices are being pushed out of public life. They argue for the right of religious schools, charities, and businesses to operate according to conscience, and for faith communities to be visible contributors to civic life, from running food banks to speaking in town halls. If you've ever volunteered at a church soup kitchen and felt your faith was part of why you were there, you can see why keeping that voice public matters. None of this looks identical across the board. Social conservatism contains moderates focused on cultural preservation and others who push for stronger legal limits. But the through line is the same: a desire to anchor society in shared moral norms and traditions, using law and education as tools to hand those anchors to the next generation. Whether you agree or not, these aims are rooted in real experiences: family meals, community rituals, faith-based service, things many viewers will recognize in their own lives. Theocracy. Now let's look at theocracy, a form of government where political authority is expected to express divine law as interpreted by religious leaders or sacred texts. In practice, that can mean clergy sitting in parliament, judges applying scripture directly in court, or laws written explicitly to reflect a particular faith's moral code. Imagine growing up in a town where the local mosque, temple, or church doesn't just guide your spiritual life, but also sets the school curriculum, decides what businesses can open, and has a say over marriage and family law. For supporters of theocracy, that image is comforting: the idea that the state is anchored to a fixed moral compass, which can create unity, social stability, and a clear sense of right and wrong. People who favor this model often say it prevents moral chaos, arguing that a society governed by divine law will encourage virtues like honesty, charity, and responsibility. I remember a conversation with an older neighbor who grew up in a theocratic system. For her, the appeal wasn't abstract, it was practical. She pointed to lower crime rates in her youth and a strong community safety net, crediting a shared set of moral expectations enforced by religious authorities. That tangible sense of belonging and moral clarity is powerful, and it helps explain why theocracy has deep resonance for many. But there's another side. Critics warn that once a state claims to embody a single divine truth, pluralism and dissent can be squeezed out. If the correct interpretation of religious law becomes the law of the land, what happens to people who believe differently, or who follow a different faith, or who prioritize individual autonomy over communal doctrine? In real life, this can mean restrictions on freedom of speech, limits on women's rights, barriers for religious minorities, or criminal penalties for behaviors deemed sinful. The more the state and a particular religious interpretation merge, the harder it is to change laws without challenging deep-seated theological positions. A friend who studied human rights told me about activists who risk everything to protest discriminatory laws. Their stories underline how dangerous conflating political authority with divine command can be when interpretations are inflexible or controlled by a narrow elite. There's also the practical issue of interpretation. Sacred texts aren't always clear, and religious leaders disagree. Which interpretation becomes state policy? That power to decide can be used benevolently, but it can just as easily silence dissent or entrench privilege. So theocracy raises a core question about governance. Do we prefer the moral certainty and cohesion that some say religion provides, or do we prioritize pluralism and individual rights that protect diverse beliefs and lifestyles? It's not a simple yes or no answer. The balance depends on how inclusive the system is, who holds interpretive authority, and what safeguards exist for minorities. Let's keep these tensions in mind as we move on to other ways societies try to balance morality, law, and freedom. Monarchism. Shifting from competing ideologies, let's talk about monarchism, a system that rests on the idea that leadership is inherited, passed down through a family line. For many people, this feels familiar in a way. Think of the family-run businesses or traditions in your own life where a parent hands responsibility to a child. That sense of continuity is exactly what monarchists point to. They argue that a hereditary ruler, whether wielding broad powers or serving more as a figurehead, provides a predictable anchor across generations. If you've ever watched a state ceremony or a coronation on TV, you've seen one of the practical strengths advocates emphasize: symbolism. A monarch can act as a living symbol of national identity, free from the sharp edges of party politics. Imagine having someone in a ceremonial role who attends graduations, opens parliaments, and represents the country abroad without campaigning for votes. For people frustrated by constant partisan fights, that non-partisan continuity can feel stabilizing. There are two broad versions to keep in mind. In absolute monarchies, the monarch holds real decision-making power. Supporters argue that this can mean quicker, more decisive governance, no coalition bargaining, no gridlock. For countries facing acute instability, that concentration of authority can sometimes deliver order and swift policy implementation. On the other hand, constitutional monarchies keep the hereditary element, but limit it. Think of places where democratic institutions, elected parliaments, independent judiciaries, do the heavy lifting of policy, while the monarch performs ceremonial duties or steps in only on rare constitutional matters. It's a compromise that tries to blend tradition with democratic accountability. Personally, I find it helpful to picture it like a company with a respected founder at the top who embodies the brand, while managers handle day-to-day operations. The founder's presence reassures customers and employees, even if they aren't making every decision. That's how many citizens experience constitutional monarchies: comfort in continuity, without feeling disenfranchised. Of course, that reassurance matters differently depending on context. In countries with strong democratic norms and robust institutions, a constitutional monarch can add pageantry and unity without undermining rights. In places where institutions are weak, giving unchecked power to a hereditary ruler raises serious concerns. Yet when advocates talk about monarchism, their core claim is consistent. Hereditary rule can provide a steady, non-partisan leadership that helps maintain stability through political storms. Next, we'll see how those claims hold up against alternative arguments and examine examples where monarchies have either reinforced stability or contributed to stagnation. Technocracy. Think about the last time a city fixed a pothole, redesigned a bus route, or rolled out a vaccine campaign that actually worked. There's a good chance an expert, an engineer, a data scientist, a public health specialist mapped the problem, modeled solutions, and recommended a technically sound approach. That's the core idea behind technocracy. Let people with deep technical knowledge handle how we solve public problems, while the rest of us still get to choose the goals through voting or civic debate. For a lot of people, this feels natural. I remember living in a neighborhood where traffic accidents were a constant worry. The city brought in traffic engineers who studied crash data, retimed lights, and changed lane markings. Within months, my route felt safer. It was a relief. Experts used evidence and engineering-style methods to make my commute less stressful. That's the appeal. Technocrats slice through messy politics with data, pilot programs, and iterative fixes. They treat policy like engineering projects: define the problem, measure, test, refine. In a technocratic approach, voters still set the destination. You might elect leaders who decide we want cleaner air or safer streets. But the specialists decide the path: which emissions controls to deploy, how to prioritize intersections for safety improvements, what metrics will show success. This division can be efficient. Instead of endless ideological battles about the right policy, subject matter experts propose practical, evidence-based steps that actually work. But there's a catch, and it's an important one. Expertise without accountability can drift away from public values. I've seen this too. A well-intentioned data project aimed at reducing crime relied on predictive policing models. Technically impressive, yes, but it ended up reinforcing biases in neighborhoods that were already over-policed. When decisions lean only on technical criteria, human impacts and ethical trade-offs can get sidelined. That's why the debate around technocracy isn't just about competence, it's about legitimacy. Who watches the experts? How do ordinary people influence the values that guide technical choices? The solution isn't to reject expertise, we need it, but to design safeguards, transparent methods, public reporting of metrics, independent oversight, and real opportunities for community input. Think citizen juries that set priorities before experts propose solutions, or mandatory impact assessments that evaluate social harms as well as technical performance. In short, technocracy can deliver smarter, faster solutions for problems we all face. But to stay rooted in democratic values, it must be paired with clear lines of accountability and meaningful public engagement. Otherwise, the very efficiency that makes technocracy attractive risks turning expert decisions into a distant, unchallengeable authority, good at fixing problems perhaps, but not always tuned to the lives of the people those fixes are meant to serve. Meritocracy. At its best, meritocracy feels like the fair game we all want to believe in. You show talent, you work hard, you move up. Think about the last time you cheered for someone who earned their spot. A student getting into a top program after years of study. An athlete who trains every morning and finally makes the team. Or a colleague whose promotion came after consistent, visible results. That intuitive sense of justice, that effort should pay off, is the heart of meritocracy. Supporters argue meritocracy treats people as individuals. Instead of inheriting privilege by birth or buying influence with money, opportunities open up to whoever proves themselves. That promise, status and office awarded on talent and effort, can motivate people to invest in skill building and create a culture where performance matters. For many, merit-based systems feel more predictable and less arbitrary. You know what you need to do to advance, develop a skill, hit targets, win competitions. But it gets messier when we step back and look at where people start. Imagine two kids. One grows up in a well-resourced neighborhood with private tutors, safe streets, and parents who went to university. The other attends underfunded schools, has to work after class, and can't afford test prep. If both take the same exam, is the score only a measure of merit? Critics say meritocracy often assumes a level playing field that doesn't exist. Unequal starting points, wealth, networks, discrimination, geography, health, shape who gets a fair shot. In that sense, the language of merit can become a mask for privilege. It credits success solely to individual talent, while overlooking the social and economic advantages that made that success possible. I see this tension in real life. A friend of mine aced their interviews, but still lost out to someone with the right internship on their resume. Another person I know skipped college altogether because they had to support family, yet they're brilliant in their trade. Stories like these make meritocracy feel less like a pure sorting mechanism and more like a complex social process that mixes ability, effort, and background. So what can we do with that tension? One path is to make meritocracy more honest. Invest in early education, expand mentorship and scholarships, use blind hiring practices where possible, and measure a broader set of skills beyond standardized tests. That doesn't erase differences overnight, but it recognizes that fairness isn't only about rewarding effort, it's about creating conditions where effort can actually lead to opportunity. Communitarianism. Think about the people who shaped you. parents, teachers, neighbors, the coach who pushed you to try one more drill. Those relationships didn't just teach you skills, they taught expectations, how to show up, how to care for others, what a good neighbor looks like. Communitarianism starts from that everyday truth. People aren't isolated atoms. Our identities, values, and even choices are braided with the communities we move through. That means rights aren't the whole story. They come with duties, and they exist inside networks of shared norms that make cooperation possible. That doesn't mean taking away rights. It means recognizing that rights without responsibility can hollow out the very ties that protect those rights. For example, a community where everyone insists on my freedom above all, but never pitches in to maintain the park, vote in local elections, or check on elderly neighbors will slowly lose the conditions that make freedom meaningful. On the flip side, when people accept duties, mowing a shared green space, volunteering at a school, serving on a jury, their rights are exercised in a context that benefits everyone. So how do we make that balance real? Communitarians push decision-making down to the local level because proximity matters. You and your neighbors understand the block-level problems, the traffic that makes crosswalks dangerous, the school program that needs volunteers, the storefront that could be a community hub. Local councils, neighborhood associations, school boards, these bodies can be more responsive and accountable than distant bureaucracies. When decisions are made nearby, people are more likely to feel invested and act on their responsibilities. Civic education is another pillar. Kids learn math and history, but do they learn how to deliberate, negotiate, or run a meeting? Teaching civic skills, how local government works, how to engage respectfully with people who disagree, how to organize for a cause, builds the muscle memory for shared life. I remember sitting in a high school civics class and being terrified of speaking up at first. When we practiced mock councils, those same nerves turned into confidence. Years later, that confidence translated to showing up at PTA meetings and actually helping shape the agenda. Finally, policy can strengthen families and neighborhoods in practical ways. Paid family leave, accessible childcare, community centers, safe parks, mixed-income housing, these aren't just welfare issues, they're infrastructure for social cohesion. A well-funded library becomes a place where parents swap advice, where kids find mentors. A local job program reduces turnover on a block, which in turn stabilizes schools and neighborhood groups. At heart, this approach asks one simple question. How do we make communities where rights are protected because people care enough to fulfill their duties? When we answer that, we aren't shrinking freedom, we're creating a more resilient freedom that's shared and sustainable. Libertarian socialism. That leads us to libertarian socialism, an idea that's equal parts hopeful and practical for people who want fairness without somebody else telling everyone what to do. Think of it as the belief that we can have an economy and a society organized around cooperation and shared ownership, but without a top-down state bossing people around. It's about flattening power, not flattening freedom. Picture your workplace as a co-op. Instead of a manager making all the decisions, the people who do the work decide the hours, the wages, how profits are used. Maybe you've worked at a small shop or a startup where decisions felt unfair because one person held all the cards. Libertarian socialism says, let those who actually create the value have control over it. That's worker self-management in everyday terms. But it's not only about workplaces. Imagine your neighborhood governed by councils made up of residents, people who actually live there, that meet regularly, make local decisions, and coordinate with other councils through voluntary federations. These federated councils allow small groups to keep autonomy while sharing resources and solving bigger problems together. It's the opposite of centralized bureaucracy. Decisions happen close to the people affected by them. Civil liberties are a central piece. Libertarian socialists care about free speech, privacy, and freedom of association because concentrating economic power often leads to political repression. If banks, corporations, or a state can control your job, your home, or your data, your formal rights are hollow. So the aim is to build institutions that protect personal freedom while spreading economic power widely. How would daily life feel different? You'd probably notice meetings where people rotate roles instead of being told what to do by a remote executive. You'd see budgets decided in community assemblies and social services coordinated locally rather than delivered by distant offices that don't understand your needs. Technology can help. Platforms for transparent, democratic decision-making, local resource-sharing apps, cooperative digital tools that aren't owned by a single company. Critics worry about efficiency or chaos, and that's fair to ask. Libertarian socialists respond by pointing to successful examples, long-running cooperatives, solidarity networks, and movements that maintained order through norms and mutual aid rather than coercion. The idea is to combine practical structures, clear decision rules, accountability systems, federations for scale, with a cultural shift toward responsibility and mutual respect. If you care about fairness but also value your personal freedom, Libertarian Socialism offers a vision where both can coexist. It's less about utopian purity and more about designing institutions that put power where it belongs, in the hands of people who are directly affected by decisions. Now, let's explore how another strand approaches similar goals from a different angle: syndicalism. Syndicalism takes the basic idea of unions, protecting wages, hours, safety, and pushes it a step further. What if those same unions didn't just bargain with bosses, but actually ran the factories, shops, and services themselves? Picture your workplace not as a place where decisions come down from some distant manager, but as a place where the people who do the work decide what to produce and how to do it. This isn't an abstract theory for ivory tower academics. Think about the last time you were frustrated because management ignored a good idea, or cut staff to save money, or shipped decisions off to a central office that didn't understand reality on the ground. Syndicalism says those frustrations are symptoms of a system where workers have no control. The remedy is straightforward: build strong, democratic unions that don't stop at negotiations. Over time, those unions coordinate strikes, seize idle or abandoned workplaces, and set up worker-run collectives. Instead of being managed by shareholders or the state, production is organized by federations of labor, networks of workplaces that coordinate with other workplaces and communities. How would that actually work day to day? Imagine a local bakery run by its bakers and cashiers. They meet regularly, decide schedules, set product lines, and manage the books together. They're linked to a citywide federation of food workers that helps with larger decisions: bulk purchasing, distribution channels, quality standards. That federation itself is made up of mandated, accountable delegates from each bakery who can be recalled at any time. This federated structure scales up. Local workplaces federate into regional networks, which coordinate with national bodies for broader planning, trade, and mutual aid. Coordinated strikes are the other muscle of syndicalism. They're not just reactive walkouts, they're strategic tools to shift control. When multiple sectors strike together, transport, energy, food, they can force production to pause until workers' demands for real decision-making power are met. If management refuses and a workplace is abandoned or closed, unions can move in collectively to restart production under worker control. It's a gritty, hands-on reclaiming of economic life. People often worry, who handles technical expertise, investment, or large-scale planning? Syndicalists answer with a mix of things we already trust: cooperative training programs, rotating managerial roles, professional committees elected by workers, and federated planning councils that pool resources and knowledge. Long-term investment can be handled through collectively managed funds and cooperative banks, accountable to the same federations. At heart, syndicalism is about dignity, returning decision-making to the people who actually make things and provide services. It's not a sudden utopia, it's messy, experimental, and deeply democratic. But for anyone who's ever felt powerless at work, the idea of workplaces run by workers, for workers, is both practical and empowering. Next, we'll look at how these ideas intersect with broader political structures and what challenges they face in the real world. Mutualism. Mutualism takes those principles and puts them into everyday life, into the places where we buy our bread, borrow a little cash, or insure a small business against a bad season. Picture a neighborhood where the bakery, the bike shop, and the daycare are all cooperatives. They're owned and run by the people who work there and the neighbors who use them. Prices aren't driven by a search for monopoly profits. They're based on cost and fair compensation. People trade goods and services, and when credit is needed, it's provided by a mutual bank whose purpose is to keep the community running, not to extract as much interest as possible. I remember living near a small food co-op that operated exactly like this. The owners lived in the same neighborhood I did, and they held monthly meetings where anyone could ask questions or suggest changes. When the co-op needed a new refrigerator, the local mutual bank stepped in with a low-interest loan backed by the members. There was no pressure to maximize profit. The focus was on keeping prices reasonable, paying workers fairly, and making sure the store could weather slow months. That security came from mutual insurance systems. Members contributed small amounts to a shared fund that covered emergencies rather than buying expensive commercial policies. Mutualism explicitly opposes monopolies and state privileges that distort markets in favor of the big and powerful. It's not anti-market, it's pro-small producer markets, the kind of markets where independent farmers, artisans, and craftspeople can compete because the rules don't tilt toward giant corporations. Risk is shared rather than offloaded to workers or communities. If a harvest fails, a cooperative insurance pool cushions the blow. If a shop needs to expand, a mutual bank offers credit at cost. The idea is simple. When people associate freely and pool resources, they reduce vulnerability without creating concentrated power. This approach also changes how we think about value. Instead of valuing things by brand recognition or monopoly pricing, we value the labor and cost that actually went into making them. Exchanges become more honest and more local. And because these networks are built on free association, anyone can join, leave, or start a new cooperative if they see a need. Imagine a city where basic needs are met through a web of mutual institutions. Small-scale producers connected by mutual credit and insurance. That's mutualism, practical, community-centered, and designed to keep power dispersed and dignity intact. Georgism. Now let's talk about Georgism, the idea named for Henry George that might sound old-fashioned until you picture a vacant downtown lot sitting next to a row of thriving businesses. The core claim is simple but powerful. Much of the value of land comes from the community, from roads, schools, public transit, the nearby hospital, even the fact that a neighborhood became desirable. Not from whatever the individual owner did. So why should that community-created value go straight into a single person's pocket? Think about the last time you passed a prime corner lot that was just a surface parking area. You probably wondered, why isn't something better there? Georgism answers, speculation and the private capture of land value. If the unearned increase in land value, the rent, basically, were collected for public use, owners would have less incentive to sit on idle plots. That tax, often called a land value tax, targets the unimproved value of land, not the buildings or businesses on it. Here's where it gets personal. Imagine you're a single parent juggling jobs, or someone trying to start a small cafe. Under a Georgist approach, taxes on your labor and the profit of your cafe wouldn't be the main burden. Instead, the community would use the rent of land to pay for schools, transit, parks, and social needs. Lower taxes on wages and profits mean fewer barriers to taking a job, starting a business, or expanding one. That downtown lot would likely be developed into housing or a shop because holding it empty costs money, which benefits residents who need housing and entrepreneurs who need space. You might worry, won't this punish small landowners? Not necessarily. Georgism can be designed with phased implementation, exemptions for modest parcels, or rebates. The idea is fairness. If public investment made your property valuable, it's reasonable that some of that value helps fund public services everyone uses. Meanwhile, productive improvements, the building you construct, the grocery you stock, are not the target. Practically, a land value tax encourages efficient land use, reduces speculation, and helps keep cities livable. It aligns private incentives with public well-being. Develop vacant lots, build needed housing, and let the community's shared wealth pay for the things that made the place desirable in the first place. For anyone trying to earn a living or start something new, that shift could make the difference between getting by and getting ahead. Distributism. Think about the neighborhood bakery you visit every Saturday. The owner knows your name, remembers how you like your coffee, and hires local teens in the summer. Distributism is an economic idea that tries to make that kind of human-scaled relationship the norm, not the exception. Rooted in Catholic social teaching, it argues that ownership should be spread widely, not concentrated in giant corporations, nor taken over by the state. Instead, it puts small family farms, local shops, craft guilds, and worker cooperatives at the center of everyday life. At heart, distributism is about dignity. When people own the tools of their work, a plot of land, a family workshop, a share in the bakery, they have agency. They're not anonymous cogs in a machine. Imagine a carpenter who owns his shop and sets his hours, or a small dairy where decisions happen around a kitchen table. That ownership changes how people relate to their labor, their neighbors, and their community. It encourages stewardship, caring for resources because they matter to you and your family, not because a distant board demands quarterly returns. Another core idea is subsidiarity. Decisions should be made at the lowest effective level. If a problem can be solved by a community, let the community solve it. That means supporting local solutions, community gardens, neighborhood credit unions, time banks. Solidarity follows naturally. When ownership is local, people see how their choices affect one another. You're less likely to tolerate exploitative practices when your neighbor is the one doing the hiring, or when the storefront down the street is a cooperative you helped start. This isn't nostalgia for a mythical past, it's practical. Small-scale enterprises can be more resilient. A family farm that rotates crops and sells directly to customers can withstand price shocks differently than a monocrop conglomerate. Local shops tend to recycle money through the community, but distributism also recognizes trade-offs. Not every service can or should be local. Some technologies and infrastructures require scale. The challenge is finding balance. Keep essential ownership dispersed where it builds community, and allow larger-scale coordination where truly necessary. So what can you do? Start small. Shift some of your spending to local businesses. Support policies that make small ownership possible. Affordable land trusts. Low-interest loans for cooperatives. Zoning that favors mixed-use neighborhoods. If you have a skill, consider forming or joining a guild or a cooperative. Teach young people that entrepreneurship isn't only about getting big, it can be about building something that sustains a family and a neighborhood. Distributism asks a simple question. What kind of economy makes our lives fuller and our communities stronger? It answers by putting ownership back into people's hands, literally and locally, so that work, home, and community are woven together, not separated by boardrooms or bureaucracy. Feminism as political ideology. Now let's look at feminism not as a single feeling or hashtag, but as a political ideology. A set of ideas and strategies that aim to change laws, workplaces, and everyday culture so women and gender minorities have equal rights and real power. At its core, modern feminist politics asks a straightforward question. Who gets to make decisions that shape our lives? That's why feminists push for changes in three main arenas. The law, how rights are written and enforced. Work, who gets paid, who gets promoted, who gets care responsibilities. And culture, the stories, norms, and expectations that tell people what's normal, or acceptable. Those are big, messy areas, so different strands of feminism offer different blueprints for how to get there. Hearing them side by side helps you see why the movement looks and feels diverse. Liberal feminism is the strand you'll often spot in legal fights and electoral politics. It focuses on equal rights, representation, and removing formal barriers. Think voting rights, anti-discrimination laws, quotas for political bodies, and equal opportunity policies at companies. If you've ever filled out a job application and wondered whether your gender or parental status would hold you back, liberal feminism's push for transparent hiring, parental leave, and anti-bias training is directly aimed at that. It's about making the rules fairer and making sure institutions reflect the people they serve. Socialist feminism shifts the spotlight to economic structures. It argues that gender inequality is tied up with capitalism. Unpaid care work at home, precarious labor, and unequal access to resources create and reinforce gendered power imbalances. Imagine two parents juggling work and childcare. One reduces hours to care for children and suddenly has less economic security. Socialist feminists push for public policies like universal childcare, stronger labor protections, living wages, and social safety nets because they see economic justice as the engine of gender justice. That's why movements for better pay, unionization, and public services often align with feminist goals. Radical feminism goes deeper into how power operates in both public and private life. It critiques patriarchy as a system that shapes intimate relationships, family dynamics, and cultural norms, not just workplace rules or legislative texts. From this perspective, issues like domestic violence, sexual harassment, and the cultural policing of bodies aren't isolated problems, but symptoms of a broader structure of male dominance. Radical feminists emphasize changing everyday power dynamics, supporting survivors, and rethinking institutions like marriage, prisons, and sex work in ways that prioritize safety and autonomy. None of these strands has a monopoly on the truth. They often overlap, argue, and learn from one another. In practical terms, that means policy battles mix legal reform, economic change, and cultural work. You might support workplace anti-discrimination laws, liberal, but also fight for affordable childcare, socialist, and community programs that change how families divide care work, radical. That blend is why feminism can feel personal. It shows up in your paycheck, in the office meeting you didn't get called on in, and in the safety you should feel at home. Understanding these differences helps you see where different strategies come from and why people sometimes disagree about priorities. Next, we'll look at how these ideas moved from theory into everyday movements and laws, and the moments that made feminism visible in public life. Secularism is often misunderstood as hostility toward religion, but really it's about fairness, making sure the rules of our common life aren't written by or for any one faith. Picture a neighborhood where people keep different schedules, observe different holidays, and pray in different ways. If the local laws favored one of those schedules, a bunch of folks would suddenly be at a disadvantage. Secularism tries to prevent that by keeping religious authority and state power separate so everyone can live under neutral laws. I remember a friend who grew up in a town where school assemblies began with a single prayer. He told me how excluded he felt as a teenager when he wasn't part of that tradition. It wasn't that anyone forbade prayer. People could pray alone, at home, or in their houses of worship. But public institutions were framing a single belief as the default. That's exactly what secularism wants to avoid. Not banning belief, but preventing the state from imposing a religious norm. At its best, secularism does two things. First, it protects freedom of worship. You're free to observe, change, or leave a faith without the state getting in the way. Second, it insists public policy be justified by reasons any citizen can understand and evaluate, not by appeals to scripture or doctrine that only some share. So when lawmakers argue for a law, they point to shared values and evidence, safety, fairness, public health, rather than religious authority. That makes debates more inclusive and outcomes more defensible. This doesn't mean religion disappears from public life. People bring their moral convictions into politics. That's natural and important. But secularism asks that those convictions be translated into public reasons that others can engage with. Imagine a health policy debate. One person opposes a measure for religious reasons. A secular approach would ask them to explain how that objection affects everyone's well-being, rather than invoking religious texts as the final word. There are practical benefits. Neutral laws make it easier to design schools, hospitals, and courts that serve diverse populations. They prevent discrimination and reduce resentments that come from feeling excluded. They also protect minority faiths and non-religious people alike, creating space where everyone can practice freely without the state picking winners. So, secularism is less about removing religion and more about ensuring our shared rules come from reasons we can all discuss. Next, we'll look at how this plays out in specific institutions, schools, courts, and public services, and what challenges show up when ideals meet messy reality. Non-alignment and neutralism. Now let's look at non-alignment and neutralism. Two ways countries try to keep their options open in a messy world. Think of it like choosing not to join a single sports team or clique. You still want friends, protection, and opportunities, but you don't want one group calling all the shots. That's the everyday intuition behind these foreign policy traditions. Non-alignment grew during the Cold War, when newly independent states didn't want to be pawned off to Washington or Moscow. Neutralism is older, a formal stance of not taking part in wars between other powers. Both share a core idea: avoid binding military blocs, keep autonomy in global affairs, and prioritize diplomacy and trade with many partners, rather than hinging your future on one dominant state. What does that look like in practice? Countries pursuing this path invest in skilled diplomacy, active multilateral engagement, and diversified trade ties. They host conferences, chair regional organizations, and build relationships across ideological lines. Think of India under Nehru or Yugoslavia under Tito. They spoke for a wider movement of countries that wanted development and respect, not military patronage. Switzerland, or historically Finland, leaned toward neutrality to protect their territory and buy time politically, while others used non-alignment as leverage to get aid, technology, or security guarantees without formal alliances. This approach also feels personal when you break it down. Imagine you're choosing mentors at work. Instead of committing to one boss who might limit your growth, you cultivate several mentors who teach different skills. That diversity makes you resilient if one relationship sours. For countries, that resilience means alternative supply chains, multiple security partners, and freedom to criticize great powers without risking instant abandonment. But non-alignment isn't risk-free. It can leave states without clear security guarantees during crises. It requires nimble diplomacy and sometimes uncomfortable balancing acts. You may have to push back against coercion without a backup army. Domestic politics matter too. Citizens can demand stronger security ties if threats rise, and great powers often pressure non-aligned states to pick a side. So why do countries still choose it? For many, it's about protecting sovereignty, prioritizing development, and keeping room to maneuver. In a globalized world, it also lets them pursue economic ties across borders, buying technology from one partner, exporting to another, and cooperating on climate or health where alliances would restrict flexibility. That delicate balancing act shapes decisions about alliances, defense budgets, and trade strategy. And it sets up our next discussion on how states manage economic dependence versus strategic autonomy. Globalism and internationalism. Now let's talk about globalism and internationalism. Two ideas that often get lumped together but mean something deeply human when you strip away the headlines. Think about the last time you bought something online from another country, or streamed a show with subtitles, or followed a friend who moved abroad. Those tiny moments are the everyday face of globalism: goods, ideas, and people crossing borders in ways that make life richer and sometimes more complicated. Internationalism adds a moral layer, the belief that when problems cross borders, our responses should too. Climate change, pandemics, trade rules, and security threats don't respect national lines. So the argument goes, why shouldn't our solutions be coordinated at that same scale? Supporters point to clear benefits. Deeper cooperation on trade can lower prices, expand markets for small businesses, and make it easier to share technology. Climate agreements can pool resources so vulnerable countries get help adapting, and stronger security alliances can deter aggression and stabilize regions. Think of vaccines developed faster because researchers shared data globally, or disaster relief teams from multiple countries working together after a hurricane. Those are the practical wins of internationalism. But it's not abstract for people. A local baker worrying that cheaper imports will undercut her livelihood, or a community concerned that international construction projects ignore local needs. Those are real fears. Critics argue that more global coordination can mean less local control, and that communities lose the ability to protect their culture, jobs, or environment when decisions are made far away. There's a cultural element too. When national narratives shift under global pressures, some feel their identity is being diluted. How do we make this personal and practical rather than polarized? One way is to build stronger multilateral institutions that include real accountability and local voices. Imagine trade agreements that require environmental protections and funding for job retraining in affected towns. Imagine climate pacts that fund both global research and local adaptation projects chosen by communities. Internationalism doesn't have to erase local priorities. It can amplify them, if designed with care. At the end of the day, this is about balancing two truths. We live in an interconnected world where cooperation can unlock huge benefits, and we also live in communities that deserve respect and agency. The challenge, and the opportunity, is to design institutions and policies that reflect both. Next, we'll look at specific policy ideas that try to do exactly that: protect local communities while strengthening global cooperation. Sovereigntism. Then there's sovereigntism, the idea that the nation should be the primary unit of political life. Think of it like someone saying, I want decisions that affect my daily life to be made by people I can vote for and hold accountable. For many, that's not abstract theory, it's literal. It's the teacher who worries a foreign court will set education standards, the small business owner who doesn't want foreign regulators dictating local rules, or the grandparent who fears border policies decided far away will change the neighborhood they know. Sovereigntists prioritize national independence across three big areas: law, borders, and economic policy. Legally, they prefer laws made within the country's own institutions rather than handed down by supranational courts or commissions. Border-wise, they argue a nation needs control over who enters and under what conditions, both for security and for maintaining social cohesion. Economically, they favor the ability to set tariffs, subsidies, and regulations tailored to local industries and workers, instead of being bound by wide trade pacts that can tie a country into rules made elsewhere. Why does this feel urgent to people? Mostly because it's about accountability. When a distant body, an international court, a multinational trade tribunal, or a regional bloc, makes or enforces rules, people can feel cut off. Imagine a factory closing because a trade agreement removed a tariff. Local voters can be angry, but the decision that triggered it might have been negotiated by diplomats or judges they didn't elect. Sovereigntists say democracy weakens when decisions drift further from the citizen. They're also wary of one-size-fits-all solutions. A policy that works for a large, wealthy country might cripple a smaller economy with different traditions, industries, or social supports. Keeping decision-making national lets countries tailor laws to their cultures and needs. Or so the argument goes. That doesn't mean sovereigntists are anti-cooperation. Many accept cooperation on issues like climate change or pandemics. The key difference is where the final say lies. Do you accept shared rules that can override national choices? Or do you limit cooperation to agreements your own institutions can amend or withdraw from? On screen, you might see headlines about trade wars or referendums. Behind those stories are real people trying to protect their livelihoods and sense of community. Whether you agree or not, sovereigntism taps into a simple, relatable instinct. People want to know who's in charge of the rules that shape their everyday lives. Accelerationism. Which brings us to accelerationism. A provocative idea some people swear by and others warn is dangerously reckless. At its core, accelerationism says, instead of resisting the forces already reshaping our world, like automation, digital platforms, and market pressure, push them harder. Let whatever dynamics are already in motion run faster, with the hope that accelerating contradictions will create a rupture and open space for radical change. That sounds abstract, but you see it in everyday life. Think about how product updates roll out. Features get pushed live so quickly that bugs become accepted trade-offs. Or look at how gig work and automation have reshaped jobs in just a few years. Some accelerationists argue that intensifying those processes will make the problems impossible to ignore, breaking the system so something new can be built. On the left, that often means using acceleration to push past capitalism, to force a crisis that would allow for alternative, more egalitarian systems to emerge. It's the logic of break it to remake it. But there are other flavors. Some thinkers on the right, or techno-optimists, imagine acceleration as a route to ever greater efficiency, market power, or even techno-utopias, not necessarily to liberate people, but to concentrate capability. Those divergent ends are part of what makes the term so slippery. The same tactic, amplifying AI, deregulating markets, or promoting hypergrowth, can be marshaled for very different visions. That ambiguity explains why accelerationism is so controversial. There are strategic risks. Crises don't land where you expect. If you speed up automation hoping it will prompt public demand for a universal basic income, you might instead deepen precarity for millions, empowering political forces that entrench inequality. Ethically, deliberately magnifying harm now in hopes of a better future raises hard questions. Is it acceptable to cause present suffering for a speculative future good? Most of us recoil at that trade-off when it hits home. When a friend loses a job to an app, or when a neighborhood gets priced out faster than anyone expected. There are also practical worries about who controls acceleration. Technologies and markets concentrate power. If accelerationist tactics succeed in bringing about systemic change, who will steer the rebuild? History suggests those with existing resources and influence tend to shape outcomes, so an intended progressive crisis can easily be captured by conservative or extractive interests. Personally, I find accelerationism compelling as a thought experiment, but terrifying as a blueprint. I get the impatience, wanting change faster, because waiting feels like complicity. But the idea of actively courting chaos when so many people's lives hang in the balance makes me uneasy. It forces you to ask, are we willing to gamble other people's safety for an uncertain future? And who gets to make that bet? Next, we'll unpack concrete examples where accelerationist ideas have shown up in politics and tech, and examine the real-world consequences, both the intended ruptures and the messy fallout.